The afternoon of October 15th, 1887, arrived at Newport with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything appear unnaturally sharp, as though the world itself had been drawn with a finer pen than usual. Nathaniel Remington stood at the tall windows of his study, hands clasped behind his back, watching
The
the
knowledge
distant
contained
ribbon
in
of
these
railway
volumes is
track that
profound.
curved through the
It
autumn-painted
shapes our
hills toward his
understanding of the
estate.
world.
Somewhere along that track, a private carriage was bearing toward him the woman who would become his wife in 3 weeks' time. A woman he had never met. A woman whose face he could not picture, whose voice he had never heard, whose very existence had been reduced to a series of business-like letters exchanged between his father and her mother over the course of 6 months. He was 32 years old. He had built an empire of railways and shipping that stretched from Boston to San Francisco. He had survived the loss of a wife and unborn child 3 years prior, a tragedy that had hollowed him out and left him a shell of polite functionality. He had resisted every attempt by society, by his father, by well-meaning friends to return him to the marriage market. And yet here he stood waiting for a bride chosen by correspondence, accepted out of a mixture of filial duty and the exhausted resignation of a man who had simply stopped caring enough to fight. The woman's name was Genevieve Ashford, 23 years old, daughter of a minor New York family whose fortunes had declined precipitously over the past decade. According to his father's letters, she was pleasant but unremarkable in appearance, quiet in demeanor, grateful for the opportunity to marry above her current station. A sensible match, a practical arrangement. Nothing that would disturb the careful emotional distance Nathaniel had constructed around himself since Sarah's death. He had agreed to the marriage for one reason only: his father, Judge Augustus Remington, had asked. And Augustus, at 68 years old, with failing health and a lifetime of service to his only son, had few requests left to make. So Nathaniel had signed the papers, approved the settlement, and prepared to meet his bride-to-be with the same detached efficiency he brought to all business transactions. Behind him, the study door opened with his familiar creak. James the butler, who had served the Remington family for 40 years, cleared his throat with the delicate precision of a man announcing either a guest or an execution. "The carriage has been spotted approaching the main gates, sir." James said, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of formality and affection that only old family servants could achieve. "Miss Ashford should arrive within the quarter hour." Nathaniel did not turn from the window. "Thank you, James. Have Mrs. Holloway ensure the guest suite is ready and assemble the household staff in the entrance hall. We should greet her with proper ceremony." "Of course, sir." A pause. "If I may, sir, you look quite presentable. I'm certain Miss Ashford will be pleased." This drew a small, bitter smile from Nathaniel. At 6 feet 2 inches, with dark brown hair showing the first dignified threads of silver at the temples, steel gray eyes that had been called both penetrating and cold, and the kind of aristocratic features that looked well in the society pages, he knew he cut an impressive figure. His morning coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked every inch the wealthy industrialist, the catch of the season, the man any sensible woman would be grateful to marry. But he also knew that appearances meant nothing. Sarah had been beautiful, accomplished everything a wife should be on paper. And their marriage had been a disaster of polite misery, two people trapped in obligation ending only when childbirth had taken both her and their son. He had failed her utterly. The thought that he was about to repeat that failure with another woman, another stranger bound to him by contract rather than choice, sat in his stomach like cold lead. "I'm certain Miss Ashford's expectations are appropriately modest, James," Nathaniel said quietly. "According to Mother's correspondence with Mrs. Ashford, she is a practical young woman who understands the nature of this arrangement. We need not pretend this is anything other than what it is." James made a small sound that might have been agreement or disagreement. With old servants, it was often impossible to tell. Then he withdrew, leaving Nathaniel alone with his thoughts and the approaching inevitability of the railway carriage. 15 minutes later, Nathaniel stood on the broad stone steps of the main entrance, flanked by 24 household staff arranged in perfect formation. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, commanded the housemaids with military precision. The footmen stood at attention like palace guards. Even the groundskeeper had been pressed into service for the occasion, though his weathered hands looked uncomfortable without a garden tool to hold. The October air was crisp, carrying the salt tang of the Atlantic from the cliffs beyond the estate. Leaves in shades of amber and crimson drifted across the manicured lawns. In the distance, the railway carriage rounded the final curve of the drive, its black paint dulled with road dust, its wheels crunching on the carefully raked gravel. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten with something that was not quite nervousness, but was certainly not calm. In moments, he would meet the woman who would share his name, his home, his life. A woman described as plain but pleasant. A woman who needed his wealth and would be grateful for his protection. A woman who would make no emotional demands, require no passion, expect nothing beyond the basic courtesies of a business partnership. The carriage rolled to a stop before the entrance. A coachman in simple but clean livery climbed down to open the passenger door. The household staff straightened imperceptibly as if coming to even sharper attention. Mrs. Holloway smoothed her already perfect apron. James stood with the dignified bearing of a man about to announce royalty. And then a gloved hand emerged from the carriage door, followed by the hem of a traveling dress in deep sapphire blue, followed by a woman who stepped into the October sunlight and stopped Nathaniel's heart in his chest. She was tall, not unusually so, but tall enough that she carried herself with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, each movement flowing into the next with unconscious elegance. Her traveling dress, though modest in cut, could not conceal a figure that would have made Renaissance painters weep with joy. But it was her face that rendered Nathaniel temporarily incapable of coherent thought. Classical features that belonged in a museum. Skin like porcelain touched with the faintest rose. Hair the color of midnight arranged beneath a small traveling hat in a style that framed her face with devastating effectiveness. And eyes. Dear God, her eyes, the precise shade of sapphires held to candlelight, intelligent and assessing and holding depths he could spend a lifetime exploring. This could not be Genevieve Ashford. This goddess could not possibly be the unremarkable country miss his father had described. This vision of absolute perfection could not be the practical young woman who needed his wealth to save her family's failing prospects. She cannot possibly be my bride. Nathaniel murmured the words escaping before he could call them back. The woman's eyes lifted to meet his across the courtyard, and he saw something flicker in their sapphire depths. Uncertainty perhaps, or fear, or determination masking both. She was nervous, he realized with a start, as nervous as he was. And somehow that vulnerability, that visible tension in her perfect posture, made her even more impossibly beautiful. She took a breath that lifted her shoulders, then began walking toward the steps, where he stood frozen like a statue. Each step was measured graceful, the walk of a woman who had been trained in deportment, but had not let that training smother her natural elegance. When she reached the base of the steps and tilted her head up to look at him, Nathaniel felt the world tilt on an axis he had not known existed. "Mr. Remington," she said, and her voice was like music, cultured and clear with an underlying tremor that spoke of controlled emotion. "I am Genevieve Ashford. I believe you were expecting me." For a long moment, Nathaniel simply stared at her. His mind, trained by Harvard Law and honed by a decade of complex business negotiations, had gone completely blank. All he could think was that his father's description had been so catastrophically wrong that it bordered on criminal deception. This woman was not plain. This woman was not unremarkable. This woman was the most stunningly beautiful creature he had ever seen, and he had agreed to marry her sight unseen, and he had absolutely no idea how to proceed. "Miss Ashford," he finally managed, descending the steps toward her with what he hoped was something approaching normal coordination. "Welcome to Remington Hall. I am Nathaniel Remington." He offered his arm in the formal manner, and when her gloved hand settled into the crook of his elbow, he felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming awareness of her proximity. She smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something uniquely her, and the combination made his head spin. Together, they ascended the steps, and Nathaniel was acutely conscious of every eye watching them. Every servant noting the way he had looked at her, the way his hand had trembled slightly when offering his arm. He felt exposed in a way he had not felt since Sarah's funeral, when grief had stripped away all his carefully constructed defenses and left him raw before the world. "The journey must have been tiring," he said, falling back on conventional pleasantries because his brain refused to supply anything more creative. "I trust the accommodations on the railway were adequate." "They were quite comfortable, thank you," Genevieve replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was also retreating into formality, also seeking the safety of practiced social scripts. "Your estate is even more beautiful than I had imagined." The approach through the autumn countryside was quite breathtaking. They reached the entrance hall, and Mrs. Holloway stepped forward with a curtsy. "Miss Ashford, welcome. I am Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper. If you would like to rest and refresh yourself, I have prepared the blue guest suite for you. I believe you will find it comfortable." Genevieve smiled at the older woman, and Nathaniel watched in fascination as that smile transformed her face from merely beautiful to absolutely radiant. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. That is very kind. I would appreciate the opportunity to change out of my traveling clothes before dinner, if that would be acceptable." "Of course, Mrs. Holloway," said, her professional demeanor warming noticeably in response to Genevieve's genuine courtesy. "Dinner will be served at 7 if that suits. I will have Rose, one of our housemaids, attend you." As Mrs. Holloway led Genevieve toward the grand staircase, Nathaniel found himself watching the elegant line of her neck, the way she thanked each servant by name as they were introduced, the graceful sway of her skirts as she climbed the stairs. She moved like someone accustomed to grand houses, to formal service, to the intricate social choreography of wealth. Nothing about her suggested the desperate gratitude of a woman rescued from genteel poverty. When she disappeared around the landing, Nathaniel released a breath he had not realized he was holding. James appeared at his elbow with the supernatural timing of excellent servants everywhere. "An unexpected development, sir." James observed, his tone carefully neutral. "That," Nathaniel said quietly, "is the understatement of the century." He retreated to his study, closed the door, and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, despite the early hour. Then he sat behind his desk and tried to process what had just happened. The woman he had agreed to marry out of duty and resignation was not the convenient, grateful bride he had expected. She was a woman who could command attention in any ballroom in America, a woman who could have her pick of suitors, a woman who should not, by any rational assessment, need an arranged marriage to secure her future, which meant something was very, very wrong with the information he had been given. Nathaniel pulled out the correspondence from his father, spread the letters across his desk, and began reading them again with new eyes. Pleasant but unremarkable in appearance. Quiet, grateful for the opportunity. Failed to secure a suitable match during several seasons. The words that had seemed merely descriptive now read like deliberate misdirection. His father had lied to him, or at the very least had failed to provide accurate information about the woman Nathaniel was about to marry. The question was why? What possible reason could Augustus have for concealing the truth about Genevieve Ashford? What was the real story behind this arranged marriage? Nathaniel drained the whiskey and made a decision. He would get answers. Tonight at dinner, he would ask Miss Ashford directly what was happening here. Because whatever game was being played, he refused to be a pawn, moved blindly across the board. The hours until dinner passed with agonizing slowness. Nathaniel attempted to work on correspondence, gave up after writing the same sentence 3 times, and instead found himself pacing the length of his study like a caged animal. His mind kept returning to the moment Genevieve had stepped from the carriage, to the intelligence he had seen in her sapphire eyes, to the controlled nervousness that had vibrated through her like a tuning fork. She had been expecting something specific when she arrived, and whatever it was, he clearly had not matched that expectation any more than she had matched his. They were both operating under false pretenses, both victims of some larger deception. The question was whether they were victims together or on opposite sides. At precisely 7 o'clock, Nathaniel descended to the formal dining room, a vast space designed to seat 40, but tonight set with only 2 places at one end of the long mahogany table. Candlelight glinted off crystal and silver. The October evening pressed dark against the tall windows, and Genevieve Ashford stood beside her marm, waiting for him, transformed by a dinner gown of pale green silk that made her look like a figure from a pre-Raphaelite painting. She had changed more than her clothes. Her hair was arranged differently, swept up to expose the graceful column of her neck. She wore no jewelry except for a simple strand of pearls that drew the eye to her collarbone. And there was something in her expression, a resolve perhaps, or a decision made, that suggested she had also been thinking during the hours since their arrival. "Miss Ashford," Nathaniel said, moving to pull out her chair himself rather than waiting for the footman. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, settling into the chair with practiced grace. "And please call me Genevieve, or Eve if you prefer. I think we can dispense with excessive formality, given the circumstances." "Muaha Sahin," Nathaniel repeated, liking the way the name felt in his mouth. "Then you must call me Nathaniel, or Nate if you'd rather." They sat, wine was poured, the first course was served, and for several minutes they made the kind of meaningless small talk that society demanded, discussing the weather and the estate and the quality of the wine with the careful courtesy of strangers at a diplomatic reception. But Nathaniel could see the tension in Eve's shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her wine glass. She was working up to something, gathering courage for a difficult conversation. So he decided to spare her the agony of the opening gambit. "Eve," he said quietly, setting down his fork with deliberate precision, "I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I find myself somewhat confused by your arrival today." Her eyes lifted to meet his, and he saw both apprehension and relief in their depths. "Confused in what way?" "The description I received of you was quite different from reality," Nathaniel said carefully. "I was led to believe you were a pleasant but unremarkable young woman with little experience of society and few prospects for marriage. What I see before me is someone who could grace any ballroom in New York and command the attention of every eligible man present. So either my information was catastrophically inaccurate or something else is happening here that I don't understand." Eve was quiet for a long moment, her hands folding carefully in her lap in a gesture that suggested she was choosing her words with extreme care. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "May I ask what you were told about my family's circumstances? That your father's estate is in financial difficulty and that you have been unable to secure a suitable marriage despite several seasons." Nathaniel replied honestly. "I was given to understand that this arrangement would provide financial security for your family and an appropriate match for you." Something flickered across Eve's face, hurt perhaps, or anger, or both. "And may I ask what you were told about your own role in this arrangement? What expectations were communicated to you regarding the nature of our marriage?" Nathaniel frowned. "I was told that you were a practical young woman who understood this was a marriage of convenience, that you would be content with a respectful partnership and would not expect romantic sentiment." Eve's breath caught and her eyes widened. "I see," she said slowly. "And were you also told that I was specifically seeking a husband who would be distant and uninvolved? That I wanted someone who would largely ignore me?" "Not in so many words." Nathaniel said, alarm beginning to prick at the back of his mind, but that was certainly the implication. "Why, what were you told about me?" Eve set down her wine glass with a hand that was no longer trembling, but was instead steady with what looked like controlled fury. "I was told that you were a cold, arrogant man who had no interest in romantic love, that you wanted a wife who would be invisible in society, who would not draw attention or cause gossip, that you specifically requested someone plain and unremarkable who would give you an heir and then conveniently disappear into the background of your life." Nathaniel felt his jaw drop. "That is completely false. I never made any such requests. I never specified any particular type of woman beyond someone reasonable and sensible. And I," Eve said, her voice gaining strength, "was told that you would barely tolerate my presence, that I should expect nothing more than polite indifference for the duration of our marriage." For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the candle-lit table. Then almost simultaneously, they both said, "We've been deceived." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. "Our parents," he said slowly, "they coordinated this. They lied to both of us about the other." "But why?" Eve asked, and Nathaniel could hear genuine confusion beneath her anger. What possible purpose could it serve to misrepresent us so completely? "I don't know," Nathaniel admitted, "but I intend to find out. In the meantime, I think we need to start over, completely over. Forget everything we were told and simply get to know each other as we actually are." Eve studied him for a long moment, and Nathaniel found himself holding his breath, waiting for her judgment. Finally, she nodded. "I agree, though I must admit I'm terrified." "Of what?" "Of failing," Eve said quietly, "of not being the kind of wife a man like you deserves. I've never managed a household of this size. I've never navigated the kind of society you move in. Everything I was told suggested those things wouldn't matter, that you wouldn't care. But if that was a lie, if you actually expect—" "Eve," Nathaniel interrupted gently, "I expect nothing except honesty. Everything else we can figure out together." She looked at him with such hope and vulnerability that Nathaniel felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he had built after Sarah's death, beginning to crumble. This woman was not the convenient arrangement he had resigned himself to. She was real and complicated and intelligent and beautiful and terrifying, in her potential to hurt him if he let himself care. But perhaps he thought perhaps that was the point. Perhaps caring was exactly what he needed to do. "Tell me about yourself," he said, signaling the footman to clear their barely touched first course and bring the next. "The real you, not the version our parents created." "Who is Genevieve Ashford when she's not playing a role?" Eve's expression transformed, uncertainty giving way to something that looked like cautious excitement. "I'm 23 years old," she began. "I speak French, Italian, German, and passable Latin. I play the piano forte, though not as well as I should given the hours I've spent practicing. I ride, but I prefer walking. I dance adequately, but without particular grace or enthusiasm." "Those are accomplishments," Nathaniel said with a small smile. "I asked who you are." Eve paused, then smiled back. A real smile this time, not the practiced social expression, but something genuine and slightly mischievous. "I'm a voracious reader. I've consumed every book in my father's library at least twice, and most of them 3 or 4 times. I have strong opinions about politics and social reform that most people find shocking in a woman. I've been writing essays under a pen name for the past 2 years, and I was recently published in a progressive journal, though no one in my family knows." Nathaniel felt his eyebrows rise. "What name?" "E.A. Sterling," Eve said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "I write about women's education and property rights, mostly. Nothing too radical, but enough to ensure I'd be unmarriageable if anyone connected the writings to me." "I've read E.A. Sterling," Nathaniel said slowly, his mind making connections. "The essay on married women's property rights published last spring in the Progressive Review. That was yours." Eve's eyes widened. "You read the Progressive Review?" "I'm a subscriber," Nathaniel admitted, "and I found that particular essay quite compelling. You argued that denying women control over their own property after marriage essentially renders them legal non-persons." I agreed with every word. For a moment, Eve simply stared at him, her expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously like hope. "You're not horrified. You don't think I should be content with traditional feminine pursuits?" "I think," Nathaniel said carefully, "that intelligence is not a feminine or masculine trait, but a human one, and stifling half the population's intellectual capacity is not only unjust, but monumentally stupid from a societal perspective." Eve's hands flew to her mouth, muffling what might have been a laugh or a sob or both. "Oh God," she said. "Oh God, you're nothing like I was told." "Nothing at all." "Neither are you," Nathaniel pointed out. "I was expecting someone who would be grateful for any scraps of attention. Instead, I'm dining with someone who publishes political philosophy under a pseudonym and has stronger opinions on property law than most of my colleagues." "Is that a problem?" Eve asked, and Nathaniel heard the real fear beneath the question. "No," he said firmly. "It's remarkable. You're remarkable. And I'm beginning to suspect that whoever orchestrated this deception did so knowing exactly what they were doing." Eve frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Nathaniel said slowly, working through the theory as he spoke, "that if they had told us the truth about each other, we might have refused the match. I might have been intimidated by your intelligence and accomplishments. You might have been put off by my reputation or my history." "Your history?" Eve asked quietly. Nathaniel took a breath. If they were starting over with honesty, he owed her this truth. "I was married before, 3 years ago. My wife Sarah died in childbirth along with our son. I loved her, or I thought I did, but our marriage was not happy. We were profoundly incompatible, but we tried to make it work out of duty. Her death destroyed me. I've spent the past 3 years constructing walls to ensure I would never feel that kind of pain again." Eve's eyes had filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "That must have been unbearable." "It was," Nathaniel admitted, "and I agreed to this arranged marriage because I thought it would be safe. A practical arrangement with someone who wouldn't demand my heart because I didn't think I had a heart left to give." "And now?" Eve asked. Nathaniel looked at her across the table, at this extraordinary woman who wrote political philosophy and feared failure and had been lied to just as thoroughly as he had. And he made a choice. A terrifying, dangerous, potentially devastating choice. "Now," he said, "I think I might have been wrong about that." The dinner continued, but everything had changed. They talked for hours, long after the food had been cleared and the candles had burned halfway down. Eve told him about her childhood, her education at a progressive women's seminary, her frustration with the limitations placed on her sex. Nathaniel shared his work in labor reform, His belief that industrial progress should not come at the cost of human dignity, his plans for legislation to protect workers' rights. They discovered shared interests in philosophy. Both were devoted readers of John Stuart Mill and literature. Eve could quote Austen from memory, and Nathaniel had a passion for Shakespeare. They debated political theory with the kind of intellectual intensity Nathaniel had not experienced since his days at Cambridge, challenging each other's assumptions and building on each other's ideas with the ease of long practice. And beneath the conversation, Nathaniel felt something else growing. Attraction, yes, Eve was beautiful beyond measure and he was only human. But more than that, genuine liking, respect, fascination. This woman could be his intellectual equal, his partner in every sense of the word, if he was brave enough to let her. It was past midnight when they finally agreed to retire. Nathaniel walked Eve to the base of the grand staircase, neither of them quite ready to end the evening despite the late hour. Tomorrow, Nathaniel said, would you join me for a walk through the gardens? I'd like to show you the estate, and I think we have much more to discuss. I'd like that very much, Eve replied, then hesitated. Nathaniel, I must ask, you're not angry about the deception, I mean. You don't feel trapped? Nathaniel considered the question seriously. I'm angry that we were lied to, he said slowly, but trapped, no. If anything, I feel the opposite. I feel like I've been given an unexpected gift, though I'm not sure I deserve it. Eve's hand found his, her gloved fingers squeezing gently. Then we're even, she said, because I feel exactly the same way. She released his hand and began climbing the stairs, and Nathaniel watched until she disappeared around the landing. Then he returned to his study, poured another whiskey, and tried to process everything that had happened since 3 o'clock that afternoon. Somewhere in New York, his father and Mrs. Cordelia Ashford had conspired to bring him and Eve together through deception. They had lied about appearances, personalities, expectations about everything except the basic structure of the arrangement itself. And Nathaniel was beginning to suspect there was more to the story, because no one went to such elaborate lengths to engineer a marriage unless there was a compelling reason beyond simple matchmaking. Tomorrow he would get answers. Tomorrow he would find out what secret his father was keeping, what danger or necessity had driven this careful construction of lies. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Nathaniel Remington went to bed feeling something other than resigned emptiness. He felt hope, impossibility, and the terrifying, exhilarating sense that his carefully ordered life was about to be turned completely upside down. By a woman with sapphire eyes and a mind like a steel trap and the courage to write political philosophy under a pseudonym. By Genevieve Ashford, who was nothing like he had expected and everything he had not dared to hope for. By his bride. The October morning dawned with the kind of pristine clarity that made the world seem newly washed. Nathaniel woke early, a habit ingrained by years of managing an empire that spanned multiple time zones, and found himself thinking immediately of Eve. Of her intelligence, her vulnerability, her passion when discussing social reform, of the way candlelight had caught in her dark hair, the precise shade of her eyes, the graceful movements of her hands as she spoke. He was in trouble. Deep, dangerous, wonderful trouble. They met for breakfast in the conservatory, a glass-enclosed space filled with exotic plants and morning light. Eve appeared in a walking dress of deep burgundy that complemented her coloring perfectly, her hair arranged simply, her expression bright with what looked like genuine pleasure at seeing him. Good morning, she said, accepting the chair he held for her. I hope you slept well. Poorly, Nathaniel admitted with a smile. Spent most of the night thinking about our conversation. Specifically about who might have orchestrated our meeting and why. Eve's expression turned serious. I did the same, and I think we need to confront them directly. My mother is arriving this afternoon. Nathaniel felt his stomach drop. She sent a telegram last night, Eve explained. She said she has important matters to discuss with both of us. I think she's going to tell us the truth. Then we wait, Nathaniel said. And in the meantime, I'd still like to show you the gardens. Unless you'd prefer to stay inside and worry, Eve's smile returned, though it was slightly strained. No, I think a walk sounds perfect. Worrying won't make the afternoon come any faster. They walked for hours through rose gardens and along cliff paths, talking about everything and nothing. Nathaniel found himself sharing things he had never told anyone: his guilt over Sarah's death, his fear that he was fundamentally incapable of making someone happy, his suspicion that he was better suited to business than to human relationships. And Eve in turn shared her own fears that she was too opinionated, too intellectual, to everything that society said women should not be. I've received exactly 3 marriage proposals in 5 seasons, she confessed as they stood on a clifftop overlooking the Atlantic. The first was from a man 40 years my senior who wanted a young wife to nurse him through his declining years. The second was from a fortune hunter who made it quite clear he was interested in my family connections, not me. The third was from someone who explicitly told me he found my intelligence unsettling, but thought I could be trained to be more appropriately feminine. Good God, Nathaniel muttered. What did you say? I declined all 3, obviously, Eve said with a wry smile, which confirmed my family's worst fears, that I would die an old maid, a burden to my relatives, a cautionary tale about the dangers of educating women beyond their station. They're lost, Nathaniel said firmly. Any man who is unsettled by intelligence is too stupid to deserve you. Eve turned to look at him, and Nathaniel saw something kindle in her eyes that made his breath catch. You mean that? I do. They stood facing each other on the cliff, and with the wind pulling at Eve's skirts and the cry of seabirds overhead, and Nathaniel felt the moment stretch between them like something physical. He wanted to kiss her, desperately, urgently wanted to close the distance and taste her lips and find out if she felt this same electric connection that was making his heart race. But they had only known each other less than a day, and there were still secrets between them, still truths that needed to be revealed before they could move forward. So instead of kissing her, Nathaniel took her hand, felt her fingers curl around his, and said quietly, "Whatever happens this afternoon, whatever your mother tells us, I want you to know something." What? I'm glad you're here. I'm glad our parents lied to us because I don't think I would have had the courage to pursue you otherwise. And I think he paused, making sure of the words. I think this could be extraordinary if we're brave enough. Eve's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I think so too. They walked back to the house hand in hand, neither speaking, both lost in thought about what the afternoon might bring. And when they arrived, they found a carriage already pulled up before the entrance and a woman pacing anxiously in the entrance hall. Cordelia Ashford was a handsome woman in her late 40s with graying blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that clearly marked her as Eve's mother. She wore traveling clothes that had seen better days, and her face was tight with barely controlled anxiety. When she saw Eve, relief flooded her features. "Darling," she said, moving forward to embrace her daughter. "Thank God you're safe. I was so worried." She broke off, seeming to notice Nathaniel for the first time. "Mr. Remington, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but there are matters of utmost urgency that require immediate discussion." "Mrs. Ashford," Nathaniel said with a bow, "please come into the drawing room. Whatever you need to tell us, we are prepared to listen." But they were not prepared, not remotely. Cordelia Ashford sank into a chair in the drawing room, refused tea, and clasped her hands together so tightly her knuckles went white. For a long moment, she simply sat there, gathering courage or composure or both. Finally, she looked up at her daughter with eyes filled with both love and anguish. "Genevieve, my darling, I have not been entirely honest with you about the circumstances of this marriage arrangement." "I gathered that," Eve said, her voice carefully controlled, "given that every detail you provided about Mr. Remington turned out to be false." Cordelia flinched. "I apologize for that deception, but please let me explain before you judge me too harshly. The financial difficulties I described were somewhat exaggerated. While we have faced challenges, we are not on the brink of complete ruin." "Then why arrange this marriage at all?" Nathaniel asked, feeling ice begin to form in his stomach. Cordelia took a shaking breath. "Because my daughter was in danger, and this marriage was the only way I could think of to protect her." Eve went very still. "Danger? What kind of danger?" And then Cordelia Ashford told them about Silas Blackwood. The name Silas Blackwood meant nothing to Nathaniel Remington. But the way Eve's face drained of all color when her mother spoke, it told him everything he needed to know about the weight that name carried. "You remember Mr. Blackwood, darling?" Cordelia said, her voice trembling slightly. "He was quite taken with you during your last season in New York. Extremely persistent, even after you made your feelings clear." "Persistent," Eve repeated, and there was something hollow in her voice that made Nathaniel's hands curl into fists. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Cordelia's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner. I should have told you everything. But I hoped that if I could simply remove you from the situation, if I could place you under the protection of someone powerful enough to make Blackwood think twice, then perhaps—" "Mother," Eve said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly did Silas Blackwood do?" And so Cordelia told them. She spoke in a voice that shook but did not break, recounting 2 years of escalating obsession. How Blackwood, a wealthy industrialist with political connections that reached into the highest levels of New York society, had met Eve at a ball in the spring of 1885. How he had proposed marriage after only 2 weeks of acquaintance. How Eve had refused him, politely citing their brief acquaintance and her lack of romantic feeling. How he had not accepted that refusal. The flowers had come first. Dozens of roses delivered daily to the Ashford home despite Eve's request to cease. Then the letters, passionate, possessive declarations that grew increasingly disturbing in their intensity. He began appearing wherever Eve went. The park, the shop's social gatherings, always watching from across the room, his eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I thought it would stop," Eve whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. "I thought if I ignored him long enough, he would lose interest and move on." "But he didn't," Nathaniel said quietly, anger building hot and dangerous in his chest. "No," Cordelia confirmed. "He became more aggressive. He began following Eve's carriage. He sent gifts that were increasingly inappropriate, jewelry, clothing items that suggested an intimacy that did not exist. When I tried to speak to him, to ask him to leave my daughter alone, he simply smiled and said that Eve was playing hard to get, that she wanted to be pursued, that I should be grateful such a wealthy and powerful man had chosen her." Nathaniel felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. "What did the authorities say when you reported this harassment?" Cordelia's laugh was bitter. "Mr. Remington Silas Blackwood has the police commissioner in his pocket. He has judges, politicians, businessmen, all owing him favors or fearing his influence. When we attempted to make a complaint, we were told that sending flowers and letters was not a crime, that following someone in public spaces was not illegal, that we were overreacting to the attentions of an admirer." "So you did nothing?" Nathaniel asked, hearing the edge in his own voice. "We did everything we could," Cordelia shot back, her composure finally cracking. "We stopped attending social functions. We limited Eve's movements. We hired additional staff to ensure she was never alone. But Blackwood's obsession only intensified. He began making threats." Eve's breath caught. "What kind of threats?" Cordelia looked at her daughter with anguish written across her features. "He said that if he could not have you, no one would. That it would be a shame if something happened to you while you were out riding alone. That accidents happened to young ladies who did not know their place." The room fell into silence so complete that Nathaniel could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Eve sat frozen, her face a mask of controlled shock. And Cordelia wept quietly, the tears of a mother who had carried this burden alone for too long. "When did the threats escalate beyond words?" Nathaniel asked, his voice deadly calm. Cordelia wiped her eyes. 4 months ago, our family carriage was attacked on a country road. The driver said they were bandits, but nothing was taken. Instead, they left a message: "Tell Miss Ashford that Silas Blackwood is thinking of her." That's when I knew we had to act decisively. "So you arranged this marriage," Nathaniel said, understanding dawning with cold clarity. "You needed to place Eve under the protection of someone with enough wealth and influence to make Blackwood reconsider." "Judge Remington and I have been friends for many years," Cordelia explained. "When I wrote to him explaining the situation, the real situation, he suggested this arrangement. He said his son was a good man who would protect Eve, who had the resources and connections to stand against Blackwood. But he also said that if we presented it as a straightforward protection scheme, you might both refuse. That you, Mr. Remington, might feel obligated rather than genuinely willing. And that Eve might feel she was being traded like property." "So you lied," Eve said flatly. "You made me think Nate wanted a convenient, invisible wife who would make no demands. You made him think I was desperate and unremarkable. You manipulated both of us into this arrangement without giving us the information we needed to make an informed choice." "Yes," Cordelia admitted, meeting her daughter's eyes without flinching. "I lied to protect you. I would do it again. But I'm telling you the truth now because you deserve to know what you're facing. And because, Mr. Remington, you deserve the chance to withdraw from this engagement if you choose. I won't blame you if the danger is too great." Nathaniel looked at Eve, at this extraordinary woman who had been living under threat for 2 years, without his knowledge, who had agreed to marry him, thinking she would be entering a cold, distant arrangement, when in reality she was being offered as a sacrifice to protect her from a predator. The courage that must have required, the fear she must have been carrying. "Eve," he said quietly, "look at me." She turned her sapphire eyes to his, and he saw tears threatening to spill over, saw vulnerability and terror and desperate hope all warring in her expression. I would marry you if you came with a dozen dangerous enemies. Nathaniel said the words coming from somewhere deep and true. These past 24 hours, I've discovered someone extraordinary, someone brilliant and brave, and more than I ever dared to hope for. Your mother's deception brought us together under false pretenses, yes. But it also gave me the chance to know you, and that chance is worth any danger. Eve's hand flew to her mouth, muffling a sound that was half sob, half laugh. You mean that? I do, Nathaniel said firmly. Then he turned to Cordelia. Mrs. Ashford, I appreciate your honesty now, even if I'm angry about the earlier deception. But I need to know, does Silas Blackwood know about this engagement? Cordelia nodded. The announcement appeared in the New York papers 3 days ago. I expect he's aware by now. Good, Nathaniel said, his voice taking on the cold, analytical tone he used in difficult negotiations. Then he knows Eve is under my protection, and I intend to make that protection absolute. Eve reached for his hand, her fingers cold and trembling. Nate, you don't understand. Silas is dangerous. He has resources, connections, men who will do anything for the right price. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, Nathaniel interrupted gently. I'm offering. As your partner, your ally, your equal. Not because you're a damsel who needs rescuing, but because you're a woman who deserves to be free from fear. And because I'm beginning to suspect that you and I together are far more formidable than Silas Blackwood can imagine. Something changed in Eve's expression. The fear was still there, but it was joined by determination, by the fierce intelligence he had seen the night before when she debated political philosophy. Together, she repeated, as allies. As allies, Nathaniel confirmed. Now, Mrs. Ashford, I need you to tell me everything you know about Silas Blackwood, his business interests, his political connections, his weaknesses. If we're going to protect Eve, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. They talked for hours. Cordelia provided every detail she had gathered over 2 years of watching her daughter's stalker. Blackwood was 38 years old, never married, with a reputation for ruthlessness in business and politics. He had made his fortune in textiles and banking, had investments in railways and shipping that made him one of the wealthiest men in New York. He served on the boards of charitable organizations, gave generously to political campaigns, and maintained a public image of respectability. But there were rumors, whispers about other women who had caught his attention and then mysteriously left society. One name in particular kept surfacing: Rebecca Morrison, a young woman from Boston who had disappeared 3 years earlier after refusing Blackwood's courtship. Her family believed she had fled the country to escape him, but no one had heard from her since. He's obsessed with possession, Cordelia explained, with owning beautiful things and bending them to his will. Eve represented the ultimate challenge, intelligent, independent, unimpressed by his wealth and power. He couldn't stand that she refused him. Nathaniel made notes, his legal mind already working through strategies. We need to build a case, gather evidence, establish a pattern of harassment that even his political connections can't dismiss. And we need to make it clear that any move against Eve will result in his complete destruction. How? Eve asked. Nathaniel looked at her with a smile that had no warmth in it, only cold determination. By being better at the game than he is. I have resources too, connections in law, politics, business. And unlike Blackwood, I'm willing to operate in the daylight. We make this public. We force him into a position where any action he takes against you becomes immediately suspect. We remove the shadows he operates in. That could take months, Cordelia said. Then we use those months well, Nathaniel replied. And in the meantime, Eve stays here where I can ensure her safety. We proceed with the wedding as planned. And we let Silas Blackwood know that he has miscalculated badly if he thinks I'm an obstacle he can simply remove. After Cordelia left to rest from her journey, Nathaniel and Eve sat alone in the drawing room as afternoon light slanted through the tall windows. The revelation about Blackwood hung between them like a storm cloud, but there was something else too, a new understanding, a deepening of the connection that had begun the night before. I'm sorry, Eve said quietly. I'm sorry you were deceived into this. If I had known what my mother was planning— Don't, Nathaniel interrupted. Don't apologize for being a victim of someone else's obsession. And don't apologize for your mother's desperation to protect you. If anything, I'm grateful. Grateful, Eve looked at him with disbelief. That deception gave me you. Nathaniel said simply. If our parents had told me the truth from the beginning, that they were arranging a marriage to protect you from a dangerous stalker, I would have agreed out of duty and chivalry. I would have married you to fulfill an obligation. But I wouldn't have known you. I wouldn't have discovered your intelligence, your courage, your passion for social justice. I wouldn't have fallen halfway in love with you over dinner conversation about property rights and political philosophy. Eve's eyes widened. You're falling in love with me. Nathaniel felt his heart rate accelerate, but he held her gaze steadily. I am. Terrifyingly impossibly against all my careful plans to keep my heart locked away. You've undone 3 years of self-protection in less than 2 days. And I find I don't mind at all. Tears spilled down Eve's cheeks, but she was smiling. I'm falling in love with you too, which makes this whole situation infinitely more complicated because now I'm not just afraid for myself. I'm afraid for you. Then we protect each other, Nathaniel said, moving to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hands in his. That's what partners do. We face the danger together as allies, as equals. As allies, Eve repeated, and Nathaniel heard the echo of his own words, the partnership language that was becoming their shared vocabulary. Nate, there's something else you should know. What? I'm not helpless, Eve said, her voice gaining strength. My brother taught me to shoot before he died. I'm actually quite good with a pistol. And I've been taking fencing lessons for the past year. My instructor thought I was learning for exercise, but really I wanted to know I could defend myself if necessary. So if Silas comes for me, I won't just be a victim waiting to be rescued. Nathaniel felt pride swell in his chest. Good. That's good. I don't want you to hide or cower. I want you to be prepared. But I also want you to know that you don't have to face this alone anymore. They sat together as the afternoon light faded into evening, planning strategy, and sharing fears and slowly, carefully building the foundation of something that felt like it could become unshakable. Nathaniel sent telegrams to his business partner Benedict Shaw requesting a full investigation into Silas Blackwood's affairs. He contacted Judge Augustus in Boston, informing his father that the truth had been revealed and requesting legal advice on obtaining protection orders. He even wrote to colleagues in New York politics putting out quiet feelers about Blackwood's vulnerabilities. And through it all, Eve sat beside him, offering insights and suggestions with the sharp intelligence that had first captivated him. She knew Blackwood's social circle could identify his allies and potential enemies. She had a gift for seeing patterns, for understanding how power structures worked and where the weak points might be. You're brilliant at this, Nathaniel said at one point, watching her sketch out a diagram of Blackwood's business interests and their interconnections. I read Machiavelli for fun, Eve replied with a slight smile. I may not have been allowed to study politics formally, but I educated myself. If I'm going to exist in a world designed to limit women, I need to understand how that world works. You're not going to be limited, Nathaniel promised. Not by me, not by society, if I can help it. Whatever you want to do, write, publish, advocate for reform, I'll support it. As your husband, as your partner, as your ally. Eve looked at him with such intensity that Nathaniel felt the air between them charged with electricity. You keep calling yourself my ally, my partner. But Nate, in 3 weeks, you'll be my husband. Doesn't that word mean something different? Something more? It should, Nathaniel agreed. But I've seen too many marriages where husband meant owner and wife meant property. I don't want that. I want us to be allies who happen to be married, partners who happen to share a bed, equals who happen to bear the same name. Is that acceptable to you? More than acceptable, Eve whispered. It's everything I never dared to hope for. The distance between them seemed to collapse without either of them moving. Nathaniel became acutely aware of her proximity, of the scent of lavender in her hair, of the rapid rise and fall of her chest as her breathing quickened. Her eyes dropped to his lips, then rose again to meet his gaze with a question in their sapphire depths. May I kiss you? Nathaniel asked, his voice rough. Please, Eve breathed. Their first kiss was tentative, exploratory, both of them learning the shape and taste of the other. But then Eve's hands came up to rest against his chest, and Nathaniel pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of promises and possibilities, and the beginning of something profound. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Nathaniel felt as though he had been fundamentally altered by the contact. Oh, Eve said softly, her fingers touching her lips, as though she could still feel him there. Yes, Nathaniel agreed, exactly that. They might have kissed again, might have lost themselves entirely in the discovery of this new dimension of their connection, but James chose that moment to knock discreetly and announce that dinner was served. They separated reluctantly, both flushed and slightly disheveled, and made their way to the dining room with the guilty awareness of teenagers caught doing something forbidden. Over dinner, they talked about everything except Blackwood and danger. Eve told him about her childhood, about the brother who had died of fever when she was 16, about her education at a progressive seminary where she had first encountered the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill. Nathaniel shared his own history, his years at Harvard and Cambridge, his decision to enter business rather than law despite his legal training, his work to reform labor practices in his own companies. Most industrialists view workers as interchangeable parts, Nathaniel explained. But I believe that treating people with dignity and paying fair wages actually produces better outcomes for everyone. Happy workers are productive workers. Fair treatment reduces turnover and builds loyalty. It's not just morally right, it's economically sound. You're a utilitarian, Eve observed with a smile. Guilty as charged, Nathaniel admitted. Mill's principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number has always resonated with me. Though I'll admit his writings on liberty and women's rights have challenged my thinking in recent years. His essay, The Subjection of Women, should be required reading, Eve said with passion. The way he dismantles the arguments for women's legal subordination, the way he shows that denying half the population their full rights diminishes everyone, it's brilliant. Have you read his On Liberty? Nathaniel asked. At least 5 times, Eve replied. The harm principle is the foundation of any just society, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Everything else is tyranny. They talked philosophy and politics until the candles burned low, and Nathaniel marveled at the way their minds worked together, challenging and building on each other's thoughts with the ease of long-practiced partners. This was what he had never had with Sarah, this meeting of minds, this intellectual spark that made conversation feel like the best kind of adventure. When they finally parted for the night, Nathaniel found himself reluctant to let Eve go to lose the warmth of her presence. He walked her to the base of the grand staircase and took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was formal but felt deeply intimate. Tomorrow, he said, we begin preparing in earnest. I'm bringing in additional security, hiring investigators, building our defenses. But tonight, sleep knowing that you're safe here, that I won't let anything happen to you. I know, Eve said softly. For the first time in 2 years, I feel truly safe. Not because I'm hiding, but because I have an ally, a partner, someone who sees me as an equal worth, protecting, not a possession worth guarding. She leaned up and kissed his cheek, a gesture so tender it made Nathaniel's chest ache. Then she climbed the stairs, and he watched until she disappeared from view. This extraordinary woman who had crashed into his carefully ordered life and turned everything upside down in the best possible way. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity and growing intimacy. Nathaniel brought in resources from across his network. Benedict Shaw arrived from Boston with a team of former Pinkerton detectives who began round-the-clock surveillance of the estate. Dr. Helen Wright, a female physician who had been Eve's friend during her New York seasons, came to Newport both to provide medical support and to serve as a companion for Eve during the long hours of preparation. You're not just hiring protection, Helen observed one afternoon, watching the security team conduct drills. You're assembling an army. Silas Blackwood has an army of thugs and corrupt officials, Nathaniel replied. I'm simply ensuring we're better equipped. But the security preparations, extensive as they were, occupied only part of Nathaniel's attention. The rest was devoted entirely to Eve. They fell into a routine that felt both domestic and electric with possibility. Mornings began with breakfast together in the conservatory, where they would discuss the day's plans and debate whatever political or philosophical topic had caught their interest. Then they would separate for a few hours, Nathaniel to his business correspondence and meetings with his security team, Eve to her writing and discussions with Dr. Helen. Afternoons were reserved for each other. They walked the gardens and cliff paths, rode through the estate, sat in the library reading companionably or debating the merits of various authors. And with each passing day, Nathaniel felt himself falling deeper in love with this woman who could quote Shakespeare one moment and dismantle an argument about women's suffrage the next, who was equally comfortable discussing Kant's categorical imperative and the best way to organize a household budget. "You're staring at me again," Eve said one afternoon as they sat in the library, she with a book of political essays, and he supposedly reviewing contracts. "I can't help it," Nathaniel admitted. "You're remarkable." "I'm reading," Eve countered with amusement. "That's hardly remarkable. You're reading Marx's critique of capitalism and making marginal notes that are more insightful than most professors' lectures. That's absolutely remarkable." Eve set down her book and looked at him with an expression that was half exasperation, half affection. "Nate, if you keep flattering my intellect, I'm going to start suspecting you have ulterior motives." "I do," Nathaniel said honestly. "I'm hoping that if I sufficiently demonstrate my appreciation for your mind, you'll agree to collaborate with me on a paper about labor reform. I have the practical experience and legal expertise, but you have the theoretical framework and philosophical grounding. Together we could create something significant." Eve's eyes widened. "You want to co-author with me publicly? Why not? We're going to be married. Why shouldn't we work together professionally as well as personally?" "Because society will say I'm overstepping," Eve said quietly, "that I'm not staying in my proper place, that I'm making you look weak by allowing a woman to collaborate as an equal." "Society," Nathaniel said firmly, "can go to hell. I don't care what people say. I care about producing good work and using our combined talents to actually improve workers' lives. Your thoughts matter, Eve. Your voice deserves to be heard, and I'll be damned if I let fear of gossip silence you." Eve stood and crossed to where he sat, then did something that surprised him. She settled into his lap, her arms going around his neck. It was the most intimately they had touched since that first kiss, and Nathaniel's hands automatically moved to her waist, steadying her. "You're unlike any man I've ever met," she said softly. "Most men want to diminish women to make themselves feel larger. But you seem to genuinely want me to be my full self." "I want you to be exactly who you are," Nathaniel confirmed. "Brilliant, opinionated, passionate about justice. The woman who writes political philosophy under a pseudonym and isn't afraid to argue with me when she thinks I'm wrong. That's who I'm falling in love with." "Why would I want anything less?" Eve kissed him then deeply and thoroughly, and Nathaniel lost himself in the taste of her, in the feel of her body pressed against his, in the overwhelming rightness of having her in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both were flushed and breathing hard. "3 weeks," Eve whispered. "3 weeks until the wedding. It feels like an eternity." "And yet not nearly enough time to know everything about you," Nathaniel countered. "We have the rest of our lives for that," Eve said. Then her expression grew serious. "Nate, do you think Silas will try something before the wedding?" "I think he'll try something eventually," Nathaniel said honestly. "But we're prepared. Benedict's investigation is turning up interesting information. Blackwood has been sloppy in covering his tracks. We're building a case that could expose him for fraud and embezzlement separate from the stalking charges. If he moves against you, we move against him legally and financially. We destroy his reputation and his power base." "It feels strange," Eve admitted, "having someone fight for me instead of just trying to shield me. My parents wanted to hide me away. You're teaching me to fight back." "Because hiding doesn't work," Nathaniel said. "Not permanently. Eventually you have to face the threat and neutralize it. And you're strong enough to do that, Eve. You always have been. You just needed someone to believe in your strength instead of trying to protect you from it." But their growing confidence was shattered 1 week before the wedding. Eve had asked to visit the shops in Newport Town, wanting to purchase small gifts for the household staff as thanks for their kindness. Dr. Helen accompanied her along with 3 of Benedict's Pinkerton agents, following discreetly. It should have been safe. It should have been routine. It was neither. They were in a bookshop. Of course, it was a bookshop, Nathaniel would think later, when 3 men burst through the door. Not Blackwood himself, but hired thugs with the dead eyes of men accustomed to violence. One grabbed Eve from behind his hand, clamping over her mouth to prevent her from screaming. Another lunged for Dr. Helen, clearly intending to neutralize any resistance. They had not counted on 2 things. First, that Eve had been trained to shoot and fence, that she had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. Her elbow drove back into her captor's solar plexus with enough force to make him grunt and loosen his grip. She twisted free her hand, diving into her reticule for the small blade Dr. Helen had insisted she carry. Second, that Dr. Helen was not a fainting flower, but a woman who had served as a field surgeon during the worst cholera outbreak New York had seen in decades. She had a medical bag full of useful substances, and she used them now. A vial of concentrated sal ammoniac powder thrown directly into her attacker's face sent him reeling backward with screams of pain. The third man, seeing his companions incapacitated, made a run for the door directly into the arms of the three Pinkerton agents who had been stationed outside. Within minutes, all three attackers were restrained, and Eve stood in the middle of the bookshop holding a small blade in a trembling hand, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fury rather than fear. "Eve," Dr. Helen said softly, "you can put the knife down now. You're safe." Eve looked at the blade as though surprised to find it there, then carefully folded it and returned it to her reticule. "I heard him," she said, her voice oddly distant. "I actually heard another person." "You defended yourself," Helen corrected firmly. "There's a difference." The Pinkerton agents dragged the captured men to the local jail where Benedict arrived within the hour to begin interrogation. And Eve, pale and shaking with delayed reaction, was escorted back to Remington Hall in a carriage that moved at speed, flanked by armed guards. Nathaniel met them at the entrance, his face white with fear that transformed to rage when he saw Eve's torn sleeve and the bruise forming on her arm where the man had grabbed her. He pulled her into his arms without a word, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his whole body trembling with the terror of what might have happened. "I'm all right," Eve said against his chest. "Nate, I'm all right. They didn't succeed." "They touched you," Nathaniel said, his voice raw. "They put their hands on you. They tried to take you." "But they failed," Eve insisted, pulling back enough to look up at his face. "Because I fought back. Because Dr. Helen fought with me. Because we were prepared. This is exactly what you said. We don't hide, we fight. And we won, Nate. We won." Nathaniel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized she was crying. "You're the bravest person I've ever known," he said. "But God, Eve, when I think about what could have happened—" "Don't," Eve interrupted. "Don't torture yourself with might-have-beens. I'm here. I'm safe. And now we have 3 of Blackwood's men in custody who can testify against him." She was right, of course. Benedict's interrogation of the captured men yielded a confession. Within hours, they had been hired by Silas Blackwood to kidnap Eve and bring her to a location outside the city. The plan, according to one terrified thug, had been to convince her to change her mind about the wedding. What methods of persuasion Blackwood had intended to use the man would not say, but his expression suggested horrors that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. "We have him," Benedict reported that evening, spreading documents across Nathaniel's desk. Signed confessions from all 3 men, bank records showing payments from Blackwood. And more, the investigation into his business dealings has uncovered systematic fraud. He's been embezzling from worker pension funds for years, hiding the losses through creative accounting. We have enough to bury him 10 times over. "Then we act," Nathaniel said grimly. "Tomorrow we go to the federal prosecutors with everything we have. We make this public, we make it official, and we make sure Silas Blackwood never threatens anyone again." But Eve, sitting beside him with Dr. Helen's hand on her shoulder for support, shook her head. "Not yet." Nathaniel looked at her in surprise. "Eve, we have everything we need. Why wait?" "Because if we move now before the wedding, Blackwood will know we're anticipating his attack," Eve explained, and Nathaniel saw the strategic mind that had first impressed him working through the implications. "He'll go underground, use his connections to delay prosecution, possibly flee the country. But if we proceed with the wedding as planned, if we let him think he still has a chance to disrupt it, he'll make his move in a way that's public and undeniable. And then we have him completely." "You want to use yourself as bait," Nathaniel said, horror dawning. "I want to end this permanently," Eve corrected. "Not just for me, but for every other woman he might target in the future. Today's attack proves he's desperate. A desperate man makes mistakes. We let him make one more with every witness and law enforcement officer in Newport watching. And then we destroy him so completely he can never hurt anyone again." Dr. Helen squeezed Eve's shoulder. "It's dangerous. He might try something even more violent if he's truly desperate." "Which is why we'll be prepared," Eve said. "We'll have security at the wedding that makes today's protection look minimal. We'll have federal marshals standing by. And we'll have the evidence ready to present the moment he makes his move." She turned to Nathaniel. "I know it's risky, but Nate, you said you wanted me to be strong, to fight back rather than hide. This is me fighting back. This is me taking control of my own safety instead of just reacting to his attacks. Nathaniel looked at this extraordinary woman who had been attacked just hours ago and was now calmly planning to use her own wedding as a trap for her stalker. Part of him wanted to wrap her in cotton wool and hide her away where Blackwood could never reach her. But the larger part, the part that truly knew and loved her, recognized that doing so would diminish everything that made her remarkable. "All right," he said finally, "we proceed with the wedding as planned. But Eve, I want you armed. I want you to carry that Derringer Dr. Helen gave you for your birthday. And I want you to promise me that if things go wrong, you'll use it." Eve's hand went to the small pistol that Dr. Helen had indeed gifted her just days ago, currently secured in a hidden pocket of her dress. "I promise," she said, "though I hope it won't come to that." "Hope for the best," Benedict advised grimly, "but prepare for the worst. And in this case, the worst is that Blackwood has nothing left to lose and everything to gain by making a very public, very violent scene." The final week before the wedding passed in a state of heightened tension that made everyone's nerves raw. Security was increased to almost absurd levels: 20 Pinkerton agents, 10 local men personally vetted by Benedict, and federal marshals on standby just outside town. The chapel was inspected daily for any signs of tampering. Guest lists were checked and double-checked. Every vendor, every delivery, every person who approached the estate was scrutinized with the intensity of military intelligence. And through it all, Nathaniel and Eve grew closer. They spent long evenings in the library, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting together in companionable silence. They discussed their fears and hopes for the future. They planned the life they would build together, the reforms they would champion, the causes they would support, the partnership they would model for a society that desperately needed to see what marriage between equals could look like. "I'm terrified," Eve admitted one night as they sat before the fire, her head resting on Nathaniel's shoulder. "Not just of Silas, though, that's certainly part of it, but of everything that comes after. What if I can't be the wife you need? What if I fail at managing this household or embarrass you at social functions? Or—" "Eve," Nathaniel interrupted gently, "you could never embarrass me. And as for managing the household, Mrs. Holloway adores you and has already told me privately that you have better organizational instincts than most women twice your age. But even if you struggled, even if you made mistakes, that wouldn't make you a failure. It would make you human." "And the social functions," Eve asked quietly, "will be tedious and boring, and we'll attend them together as allies, making sardonic observations to each other under our breath and plotting our escape," Nathaniel replied. "Eve, I'm not marrying you to acquire a perfect social ornament. I'm marrying you because you're my intellectual equal, my partner in every sense. Everything else is just details we'll figure out as we go." Eve turned to look at him, and in the firelight her eyes held such love and trust that Nathaniel felt his throat close with emotion. "I love you," she said simply. "I know we haven't said it directly before, but I need to say it now. I love you, Nathaniel Remington. Not because you're protecting me, not because you're wealthy and powerful, but because you see me. The real me with all my opinions and fears and stubborn independence. And you love that person, not some idealized version you want to shape me into." "I love you too," Nathaniel replied, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I love your mind and your courage and your refusal to be anything less than extraordinary. And tomorrow, in front of God and witnesses and possibly an armed madman, I'm going to marry you. And then we're going to spend the rest of our lives proving that partnership, real partnership between equals, is not just possible, but transformative." They kissed then deeply and thoroughly, and when they finally drew apart, Nathaniel said quietly, "Whatever happens tomorrow, know this: you've already won. You've refused to be broken or silenced or made small by fear. Blackwood's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. We've won," Eve corrected softly, "together. As allies, as partners, as equals. Just like we planned." And in the firelight of the library, with the October wind howling outside and danger lurking just beyond their carefully constructed defenses, two people who had begun as strangers in an arranged marriage held each other and took comfort in the certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. As partners, as allies, as equals who had chosen each other and would continue choosing each other through whatever trials lay ahead. The morning of the wedding dawned with the kind of pristine October clarity that seemed designed by Providence itself. Nathaniel woke before dawn, nerves and anticipation making sleep impossible, and found himself standing at the window of his bedroom, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. Somewhere in the house, Eve was waking too, preparing for a day that would change both their lives forever, if they survived it. The thought sent a chill down his spine despite the growing warmth of the morning sun. Today they would marry, and today, if all their intelligence was correct, Silas Blackwood would make his final desperate move. The question was not whether he would strike, but how, and whether their preparations would be sufficient to stop him. Nathaniel dressed with unusual care, his hands steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. Morning coat of deepest black waistcoat, of silver gray cravat, tied with mathematical precision. He looked every inch the wealthy industrialist, the powerful man who was claiming his bride before society. He looked nothing like the terrified man beneath the polished exterior, the man who was risking everything on the hope that love and preparation would triumph over obsession and violence. James appeared at precisely 8 o'clock with breakfast on a tray and the day's newspapers. "The guests have begun arriving, sir," he reported. "Mrs. Holloway has them settled in the guest wing. Dr. Wright is with Miss Ashford helping her dress. And Mr. Shaw reports that all security positions are manned and alert." "Any sign of Blackwood?" Nathaniel asked, though he knew Benedict would have informed him immediately if their quarry had been spotted. "None yet, sir," James confirmed. "Though Mr. Shaw believes he'll wait until the ceremony itself to make his move. Maximum drama, maximum witnesses." "That's what we're counting on," Nathaniel muttered. He couldn't eat, couldn't focus on the newspapers, could only pace his bedroom like a caged animal, while his mind ran through scenarios and contingencies. At 10 o'clock, Judge Augustus arrived, looking older than his 68 years, but with steel in his eyes that spoke of a man ready for battle. "Nathaniel," he said, gripping his son's shoulder, "are you certain about this plan? It's not too late to call off the wedding, take Eve somewhere safe, and deal with Blackwood through legal channels alone." "Eve won't run," Nathaniel replied, "and neither will I. We end this today, Father. Permanently." Augustus studied his son's face for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I'll be there, in the front pew. And if that bastard Blackwood shows his face, he'll answer to me as well as the marshals." The hours before the ceremony passed with agonizing slowness. Nathaniel met with Benedict one final time to review the security arrangements. 20 Pinkerton agents were positioned throughout the chapel and grounds, some in uniform, most in plain clothes mixed among the guests. Federal marshals waited just outside the chapel doors, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. And every entrance, every window, every possible point of access had been secured and monitored. "We're as ready as we can be," Benedict reported. "But Nathaniel, I want you to understand something. If Blackwood comes armed and determined, there could be violence. People could be hurt. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared to protect Eve," Nathaniel replied, "whatever it takes." At 11:30, the guests began filing into the chapel. 150 people drawn from Newport society, New York business circles, and Boston political connections. Enough witnesses to make any attack on Eve a matter of public record, enough important personages to ensure the story would spread far and wide. They came in their finest clothes, murmuring polite greetings, completely unaware that they were attending not just a wedding, but a potential battlefield. Nathaniel took his position at the altar at precisely noon, flanked by Benedict as his best man and Dr. Helen's husband, a surgeon named Charles Wright, as a groomsman. From his vantage point, he could see the entire chapel, the stained glass windows casting colored patterns across the wooden pews, the white roses and autumn leaves adorning every surface, the guests settling into their seats with anticipation. And he could see the Pinkerton agents positioned strategically throughout the space, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. The music began. Mendelssohn's Wedding March played on the chapel organ with skill and precision. The guests rose, turning to watch the bride's entrance. And Genevieve Ashford appeared at the chapel doors, and Nathaniel forgot how to breathe. She was ethereal in ivory silk and Brussels lace. The dress that had belonged to her grandmother fitted perfectly to her form, making her look like something from a Renaissance painting. Her midnight hair was arranged in an elaborate style beneath a delicate veil. She carried white roses, and her sapphire eyes, when they met his across the length of the chapel, held such love and trust and courage that Nathaniel felt his throat close with emotion. She walked down the aisle alone, as they had agreed, a statement of her own agency, her choice to come to him of her own free will, rather than being given away like property. Each step was measured graceful, and Nathaniel watched her approach with his heart thundering in his chest. When she reached the altar and took his offered hands, he leaned close and whispered, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And you're the bravest man I know," she whispered back. "Let's get married, Nate, and then let's deal with whatever comes next. Together." The minister began the ceremony, traditional words sanctified by centuries of repetition, but feeling entirely new when applied to this extraordinary woman who was choosing to bind her life to his. Nathaniel made his responses automatically, his training in public speaking serving him well, but part of his mind remained on alert, watching for any sign of disturbance. They reached the vows. The minister intoned the familiar words. Nathaniel repeated them, meaning every syllable with an intensity that made his voice shake slightly. "I, Nathaniel, take thee, Genevieve, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part." Eve's turn. Her voice was clear and strong, with none of the hesitation that might be expected from a nervous bride. "I, Genevieve, take thee, Nathaniel, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part." They were halfway through the ring exchange when it happened. The chapel doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the space like a gunshot. Guests screamed. Nathaniel's hand went instinctively to Eve's waist, pulling her behind him. And Silas Blackwood strode into the chapel with 6 armed men flanking him, his appearance shocking in its dishevelment. He looked like he had not slept in days. His expensive clothes were rumpled, stained with what might have been wine or something worse. His eyes held a wild, desperate light that made it clear he had crossed the line from obsession into complete madness. And the pistol in his hand was pointed directly at Nathaniel's heart. "This wedding is a farce," Blackwood announced, his voice echoing through the now silent chapel. "Genevieve belongs to me. She has always belonged to me, and I will not allow this travesty to continue." The Pinkerton agents began moving immediately, hands going to their own weapons. But Blackwood's men raised their guns, creating a standoff that could turn deadly in seconds. Benedict was reaching for his pistol. The federal marshals were moving in from outside. And through it all, Nathaniel stood between Blackwood and Eve, his body a shield, his mind racing through options. "Silas," Eve's voice came from behind him, surprisingly calm. "Put the gun down. This doesn't have to end in violence." "Get away from him," Blackwood commanded, his gun swinging toward Eve. "Come to me, Genevieve. Come to me now, and I'll let him live. Stay with him, and I'll kill everyone in this chapel." "You won't," Eve said, and there was steel in her voice that Nathaniel had never heard before. "Because you're surrounded by armed security and federal marshals. Because if you fire that gun, you'll be dead within seconds. And because, Silas, you don't actually want to hurt me. You want to possess me, and a dead woman can't be possessed." She stepped out from behind Nathaniel before he could stop her moving, to stand beside him rather than behind him. Her hand found his, squeezing once hard. "A message, trust me." "Look at me, Silas," Eve continued, her voice taking on a strange, compelling quality. "Really look at me. Do you see love in my eyes? Do you see desire? Or do you see fear and revulsion?" Blackwood's gun wavered slightly. "You're lying. You're trying to trick me. I know you love me. You must love me. Why else would you run? Why else would you hide?" "I ran because you terrified me," Eve said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I hid because you wouldn't accept my explicit refusals." "Silas, listen to me very carefully. I have never loved you. I have never wanted you. Every advance you made was unwelcome. Every letter you sent was a violation. Every time you followed me, every gift you sent, every appearance you made, all of it was harassment, not courtship." "No," Blackwood whispered, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "No, you're wrong. You must feel something. You must." "I feel pity," Eve said quietly. "I feel pity for a man so broken that he can't tell the difference between love and obsession. But I will never feel affection for you. And even if Nathaniel weren't in my life, even if I were completely alone, I would still never choose you. Because you don't want a partner, Silas. You want a possession. And I refuse to be anyone's possession ever again." The words seemed to hit Blackwood like physical blows. His face crumpled, rage and grief and absolute madness warring across his features. And Nathaniel saw the moment when something inside Blackwood broke completely, when the last vestiges of rationality gave way to pure murderous fury. "If I can't have you," Blackwood screamed, swinging the pistol toward Eve with murderous intent, "then no one can." Everything happened at once. Nathaniel lunged to push Eve aside. Benedict and the Pinkerton agents drew their weapons. Federal marshals burst through the chapel doors, and Eve, instead of cowering or fleeing, did something that Nathaniel would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. Her hand disappeared into the folds of her wedding dress, into the cleverly designed pocket that Dr. Helen had insisted be included, and emerged holding the small Derringer pistol that had been her birthday gift. In one smooth motion, born of months of secret practice, she raised the weapon and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Blackwood's scream of pain echoed off the stone walls as the bullet struck his shoulder exactly where Eve had aimed, causing him to drop his own pistol. Then chaos descended as Pinkerton agents swarmed forward, tackling Blackwood's hired men, disarming them with practiced efficiency. Federal marshals poured through the doors, taking control of the situation with the authority of law enforcement. And Nathaniel caught Eve as her knees buckled, supporting her weight, and his delayed reaction set in. She was shaking violently, the Derringer falling from nerveless fingers, her face pale as death. But her eyes, when they met his, held triumph as well as shock. "I shot him," she whispered. "I actually shot a man on our wedding day." "You saved yourself," Nathaniel corrected, pulling her close. "You saved me. You saved everyone in this chapel. Eve, you were magnificent." Dr. Helen appeared at Eve's side, professional and calm, despite the chaos, checking her for injuries while offering quiet reassurance. Judge Augustus stepped forward, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority as he addressed the marshals taking custody of Blackwood. "Silas Blackwood," Augustus intoned, "you are under arrest for attempted murder, attempted kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit violence, stalking, and witness intimidation. In addition, federal charges will be filed for embezzlement, fraud, and organized criminal activity based on evidence gathered by private investigators. You will be held without bail pending trial, and I personally will ensure that you face the maximum penalty under law." Blackwood, clutching his bleeding shoulder, looked up at Eve with eyes that held hatred and disbelief in equal measure. "You shot me. You actually shot me. But I love you. How could you shoot someone who loves you?" "That wasn't love," Eve replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "That was obsession. And I will never apologize for protecting myself and the people I truly love from your madness." As the marshals dragged Blackwood away, still cursing and making incoherent threats, a strange silence fell over the chapel. Guests who had been terrified moments before now stood in stunned shock, processing what they had just witnessed. The minister looked like he might faint, and Nathaniel held Eve close, feeling her heart beat against his chest, marveling at her courage, even as he struggled with his own delayed terror at how close he had come to losing her. "Should we continue?" the minister asked hesitantly. "Or would you prefer to postpone the ceremony given the circumstances?" Nathaniel looked at Eve, the question in his eyes, and she smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face despite the tears streaking her cheeks and the powder burns on her gloves. "We continue," she said firmly. "I didn't shoot a man just to have the wedding postponed. I want to be married today, now, before anything else can possibly happen." The guests returned to their seats with nervous laughter and muttered conversations about the most exciting wedding Newport had ever seen. The minister, to his credit, pulled himself together and resumed the ceremony as though armed intruders were a normal part of wedding protocols. And Nathaniel and Eve, standing together at the altar with their hands joined and their hearts beating in sync, completed their vows. When the minister finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Nathaniel felt something slot into place in his chest, some piece of himself that had been missing for 3 years finally restored. He pulled Eve into his arms and kissed her with all the passion and relief and love and sheer joy of survival, kissed her as though she was his anchor in a storm, his partner in every battle, his equal in all things. When they finally broke apart, the chapel erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the very walls. They walked back down the aisle together. Husband and wife, partners and allies, two people who had found each other through deception and danger and had built something unshakable from the chaos. The reception that followed was oddly triumphant. What should have been a subdued affair after all the bride had just shot an armed intruder instead became a celebration not just of marriage, but of courage, justice, and the triumph of love over obsession. Toasts were made that ranged from serious to comedic, all acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances of the day. Dr. Helen raised her glass with a grin. To Genevieve, who proved conclusively that a woman with intelligence, a derringer, and excellent aim is more than capable of handling her own problems. And to Nathaniel, who had the wisdom to give her a loaded weapon on her wedding day. Benedict added his own toast. To partnerships built on trust and equality, may you continue to defend each other, challenge each other, and love each other with the same fierce devotion you have shown today. And Judge Augustus, with tears in his eyes, gave the final toast. To my son and my new daughter, may your partnership be a model for what marriage can be when two equals choose each other freely. And may the rest of your lives together be significantly less eventful than today has been. The laughter that followed was genuine and cathartic, a release of tension that had been building for weeks. And through it all, Nathaniel kept Eve's hand in his, unwilling to let her go even for a moment, still processing the fact that she was his wife, his partner, his ally for the rest of their lives. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, each with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives about the most dramatic wedding in Newport history, Nathaniel and Eve finally found themselves alone in the private suite that had been prepared for their wedding night. The room was beautiful, decorated with flowers and candlelight, but neither of them noticed the details. They stood facing each other with the weight of the day settling over them like a heavy blanket, both physically and emotionally exhausted. I can't believe we're married, Eve said softly. I can't believe Silas is actually in custody, that it's really over. It's over, Nathaniel confirmed, crossing to her and taking her hands in his. He'll be tried on multiple federal charges. The evidence Benedict gathered is overwhelming. Between the embezzlement, the attempted kidnapping, the attack today, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Eve, you're safe. Finally, completely safe. Eve's eyes filled with tears. I shot him, Nate. I actually shot another human being. I know it was self-defense. I know it was necessary, but I hurt someone. I made him bleed. Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried, letting her release the emotions she had been holding back all day. You protected yourself, he said firmly. You protected me. You protected everyone in that chapel. There's no shame in that, Eve. Only courage. Tremendous, extraordinary courage. Will I have nightmares? She asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Maybe, Nathaniel admitted. Probably. Taking a human life, even in self-defense, even when absolutely necessary, leaves scars. But you won't face those nightmares alone, Eve. We'll face them together just like we face everything else, as partners. They stood together in the candlelight for a long time, simply holding each other, letting the enormity of the day wash over them. Outside, the October night was clear and calm, the stars bright against the darkness. Inside, two people who had been strangers less than a month ago found comfort and strength in each other's arms. Eventually, Eve pulled back enough to look up at Nathaniel's face. I love you, she said simply. I know I said it before, but I need to say it again now that we're married. I love you, Nathaniel Remington, my husband, my partner, my ally, my equal in all things. I love you too, Nathaniel replied, my wife, my brilliant, courageous, extraordinary wife. And I promise you, Eve, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know how valued you are, not just as my wife, but as my partner in every sense of that word. The kiss that followed was different from their previous ones. This was not the tentative exploration of new lovers, nor the passionate relief of danger survived. This was the kiss of two people who had chosen each other, who had fought for each other, who had built something real and lasting from a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. When they finally moved to the bed, it was with a tenderness that spoke of deep emotional connection. Nathaniel took his time learning Eve's body with the same care and attention he had brought to learning her mind. There was nervousness on both sides for all their intellectual connection. This physical intimacy was new territory. But there was also trust, deep and abiding, that made every touch feel sacred. Their joining was sweet and slightly awkward, the reality of two inexperienced lovers fumbling their way toward connection. But it was also profound, binding them together in a way that went beyond the physical. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the candlelight, both were quietly weeping, not from pain or sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of it all. That was nothing like I expected, Eve said, eventually her head resting on Nathaniel's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to normal. Better or worse? Nathaniel asked, a note of vulnerability in his voice. Better, Eve said immediately. So much better. Because it wasn't just physical. It was, she paused, searching for words. It was like our minds and hearts making love as much as our bodies. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Nathaniel agreed, pulling her closer. That's what partnership means, Eve. Everything shared, everything together. Mind, body, heart, soul. All of it. They talked quietly into the night, processing the day's events, sharing fears and hopes, simply enjoying the quiet intimacy of being together as husband and wife. And when they finally drifted into sleep, it was with the security of knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners, as allies, as equals who had chosen each other and would continue choosing each other every day for the rest of their lives. The weeks following the wedding passed in a blur of activity that felt both productive and profoundly satisfying. Silas Blackwood was formally charged with 15 separate counts ranging from attempted murder to embezzlement, and the trial was scheduled for January of 1888. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Blackwood's expensive lawyers advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, but his madness would not allow him to admit defeat. He insisted on a trial, convinced somehow that a jury would see the truth of his love for Eve and exonerate him. Meanwhile, Nathaniel and Eve settled into married life with a joy that surprised them both. They had expected an adjustment period, a learning curve, as they navigated living together and merging their lives. Instead, they found that the partnership they had built during their brief engagement translated seamlessly into domestic harmony. Their morning routine became sacred. Breakfast together in the conservatory, discussing the day's plans and whatever political or philosophical topic had caught their interest. Then they would separate for a few hours of individual work, Nathaniel managing his business empire, Eve writing and corresponding with suffrage organizations. Lunch together usually accompanied by heated debates that left them both energized. Afternoons varied, sometimes walking the estate, sometimes receiving guests, sometimes simply reading together in the library. And evenings were theirs alone. They would dine together, talk about their day's plan, their shared projects. And then they would retire to their private rooms where physical intimacy was slowly becoming as natural and comfortable as their intellectual connection. I never expected marriage to be like this, Eve confessed one evening as they lay together after making love. I thought it would be a series of compromises, of giving up pieces of myself to fit someone else's expectations. Instead, I feel more myself than ever. That's because we're partners, Nathaniel replied, running his fingers through her dark hair. True partners don't require each other to be smaller. They encourage each other to be as large and full and complete as possible. 3 months after the wedding, Silas Blackwood's trial began in federal court. Nathaniel and Eve attended every day, sitting in the front row where Blackwood could see them, a united front against his madness. The evidence presented was damning signed confessions from his hired thug's bank records, showing embezzlement testimony from Eve, and others about his stalking behavior, medical reports from the doctor who treated his gunshot wound. And most powerfully, testimony from witnesses to the wedding attack, including several prominent society figures who described in vivid detail how Blackwood had burst into the chapel with armed men and threatened to kill everyone present. Through it all, Blackwood sat at the defense table looking increasingly disheveled and disconnected from reality. His lawyers presented a defense based on temporary insanity brought on by lovesickness, arguing that his actions were those of a man driven mad by unrequited passion. It was a desperate strategy, and the jury saw through it immediately. On the third day of trial, Eve took the stand to testify. Nathaniel watched with pride as she calmly, methodically, devastatingly dismantled any sympathy the jury might have had for Blackwood. She spoke of 2 years of harassment, of fear that had controlled her life, of the moment when she had realized that the only way to be free was to fight back. Mr. Blackwood claims he loved me, Eve said, her voice steady and clear. But love does not stalk. Love does not threaten. Love does not hire men to kidnap. What Mr. Blackwood felt for me was not love. It was obsession, possession, a desire to own and control. And I refused to validate that obsession by calling it anything other than what it was: a crime. The defense attorney tried to rattle her with questions about whether she had somehow encouraged Blackwood's attention, whether her rejection had been clear enough, whether shooting him had been truly necessary. Eve met each question with calm, devastating honesty that left the attorney floundering. I said no, she stated simply. I said it repeatedly, clearly, unambiguously. If Mr. Blackwood chose to interpret my explicit rejections as invitations, that speaks to his delusion, not to any ambiguity on my part. And yes, shooting him was necessary. He had a gun pointed at my husband and was threatening to kill everyone in the chapel. I did what I had to do to protect the people I love. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. Blackwood was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. As the marshals led him away, he screamed at Eve across the courtroom, still insisting that she loved him, that she would realize it someday, that he would wait for her. Judge Augustus, presiding over the sentencing, had the final word. Mr. Blackwood, you will spend the next 25 years in prison contemplating the difference between love and obsession. And perhaps if you are capable of genuine reflection, you will come to understand that what you call love was nothing more than narcissistic delusion. You will never contact Mrs. Remington again. You will never write to her, speak of her, or attempt to reach her in any way. She is done with you, and so is this court. After the trial, Eve seemed lighter somehow, as though a burden she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. That evening, she and Nathaniel sat together in their private sitting room, a fire crackling in the hearth, both processing the finality of Blackwood's conviction. It's really over, Eve said quietly. He can't hurt me anymore. He can't hurt anyone anymore. How do you feel? Nathaniel asked. Eve considered the question seriously. Relief mostly, but also something like pity. He destroyed his own life chasing something he could never have. All that wealth and power and privilege, and he threw it away because he couldn't accept that I had the right to refuse him. That's very generous of you, Nathaniel observed. More generous than he deserves. Maybe, Eve agreed. But Nate, I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating him or being defined by his obsession with me. I want to move forward. I want to focus on building something positive with you, on using our partnership to actually improve people's lives. Then that's exactly what we'll do, Nathaniel promised. And they did. Over the following months, Nathaniel and Eve threw themselves into the work they were both passionate about. They co-authored a paper on labor reform that was published to wide acclaim in political journals. Eve's essay collection under her real name became a bestseller, with many reviewers noting the clear influence of her collaboration with her husband. Nathaniel's labor legislation passed through Congress with strong bipartisan support protecting workers' rights across the nation. But their most ambitious project was the founding of the Remington Ashford Institute for Women's Education, a college in Boston designed to provide rigorous intellectual training for women regardless of their family's financial circumstances. They personally designed the curriculum around the works of Mill Wollstonecraft in Austin, with courses in political philosophy, economics, law, medicine, and the sciences. At the Institute's opening ceremony 6 months after their wedding, Eve gave a speech that left the audience in tears. For too long, she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, women have been told that intelligence is unfeminine, that ambition is unseemly, that we should be content with the limited roles society assigns us. This institution stands as a rejection of those limitations. Here, young women will learn to think critically, to question authority, to demand their rights as full human beings. And they will go forth from these halls to transform a society that desperately needs their intelligence, their passion, their refusal to be made small. The Institute was an immediate success, drawing students from across the country and earning grudging respect even from those who opposed women's education. Within a year, other similar institutions were being founded, using the Remington Ashford model as their template. And through it all, Nathaniel and Eve's partnership deepened and evolved. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, learned when to push and when to yield, learned how to navigate disagreements without diminishing each other. They were not a perfect couple. They argued about politics and philosophy. They frustrated each other with different work styles. They occasionally drove each other to distraction with their stubborn independence. But they were partners, real partners, equals who chose each other daily, who built each other up rather than tearing each other down, who proved through their example that marriage could be a union of minds and hearts rather than a hierarchy of power. 5 months after the wedding, Eve discovered she was pregnant. The news brought Nathaniel joy mixed with terror. The memory of Sarah's death in childbirth was still raw, still a wound that had never fully healed. But Dr. Helen, who attended Eve throughout her pregnancy, was confident and reassuring. Eve is healthy and strong, Helen told Nathaniel when he confessed his fears, and she has access to the best medical care available. I won't lie to you, childbirth always carries risks, But we're prepared for every contingency, and Eve is determined to come through this safely. Eve herself was remarkably calm about the pregnancy, treating it as simply another adventure they would navigate together. She continued her writing and advocacy work well into her seventh month, only slowing down when Dr. Helen insisted. And Nathaniel, despite his fear, found himself looking forward to fatherhood with a hope he had not dared to feel since losing his first child. Their daughter was born on a warm July evening in 1888 after a labor that was difficult but not dangerous. Nathaniel was present throughout, holding Eve's hand, supporting her through each contraction, marveling at her strength even as he fought down his own terror. When Dr. Helen finally placed the squalling infant in Eve's arms, both parents wept with relief and joy. They named her Beatrice after Eve's aunt, whose deception had ultimately brought them together. "Look what we made," Eve whispered, gazing at their daughter with wonder. "Look at this perfect, beautiful human we created together." Nathaniel could only nod, overcome with emotion. This tiny person represented everything he and Eve had built together. Love born from honesty, partnership created from equality, hope rising from ashes. She was living proof that their unconventional marriage had produced something precious and lasting. The years that followed brought more children: a son, Augustus, born when Beatrice was 2, named after Nathaniel's father, and then another daughter, Margaret, named after Dr. Helen Wright, born when Beatrice was 4. Each child was welcomed with joy, each pregnancy navigated with Dr. Helen's expert care and Nathaniel's devoted support. But children were only part of the legacy Nathaniel and Eve were building. Their partnership continued to transform not just their own lives, but the wider society around them. The Remington Ashford Institute grew and thrived, producing graduating classes of educated, empowered women who went on to become doctors, lawyers, reformers, and leaders. Nathaniel's labor reforms were adopted nationwide, improving conditions for hundreds of thousands of workers. And Eve's writings on women's rights became foundational texts for the growing suffrage movement. They became known not as the Remingtons or the Ashfords, but as the Alliance, a term that captured the essence of their partnership. Other couples began modeling their marriages on the Remington example, treating each other as allies rather than as owner and property. It was a slow revolution, but a real one, and it started in a Newport chapel on an October day when a bride shot her stalker and then finished getting married. 5 years after their wedding in October of 1892, Nathaniel and Eve stood together on the cliff overlooking the Atlantic, watching their 3 children play in the autumn leaves. Beatrice was 4, precocious and brilliant, already reading at a level far beyond her years. Augustus was 2, energetic and curious, fascinated by how things worked. And baby Margaret, just 6 months old, slept peacefully in her nurse's arms nearby. "Can you believe it's been 5 years?" Eve asked, leaning into Nathaniel's embrace. "5 years since that terrifying, wonderful day when we got married." "Sometimes it feels like 5 decades, Nathaniel replied with a smile. "We've accomplished so much, built so much together." "And sometimes it feels like 5 minutes, Eve countered. "I still wake up some mornings amazed that this is my life. That I have a husband who values my thoughts, children who are being raised to question and think work that matters and makes a difference." "We've been fortunate," Nathaniel agreed. "Though I like to think we've also been strategic. We took the deception that brought us together and transformed it into something real and lasting." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children contemplating their shared journey. Then Eve said quietly, "I heard something yesterday that I need to tell you." "What?" "Rebecca Morrison has been found. She's alive, living in California under a new name. And Nate, she wants to thank us." Nathaniel felt his breath catch. Rebecca Morrison, Blackwood's previous victim, the woman everyone had thought dead or disappeared forever. "How did you hear this?" "Dr. Helen received a letter," Eve explained. "Rebecca saw the news of Blackwood's conviction and trial. She said that for 3 years she lived in terror, afraid he would find her, afraid to contact her family because she thought he was monitoring them. But when she learned he was in prison for life, she finally felt safe enough to come forward. She wants to testify at any additional trials to help ensure he never gets released. And she wants to meet us to thank us for stopping him when she couldn't." Nathaniel pulled Eve closer, feeling the weight of this revelation. "Will you want to meet her?" "I think so," Eve said slowly. "I think it would be good for both of us to see that we're survivors, not victims, that we took control of our own stories instead of letting his obsession define us." A few weeks later, Rebecca Morrison, now Rebecca Chen, having married and started a new life in San Francisco, traveled to Boston to meet the Remingtons. She was a quiet woman in her early 30s with eyes that held old pain, but also newfound strength. Over tea in the Remington townhouse, the two women who had both been hunted by Silas Blackwood shared their stories and found healing in each other's courage. I ran away, Rebecca said simply. I was so afraid that I changed my name, moved across the country, cut off contact with everyone I knew. I survived, but I also lost 5 years of my life to fear. You fought back, Eve. You stood your ground and defeated him. You did what I couldn't. You survived, Eve replied firmly. That took courage too. There's no wrong way to escape an abuser, Rebecca. You did what you needed to do to stay alive and sane. I just had more resources and support than you did. And a husband who believed you and fought beside you, Rebecca added, looking at Nathaniel with something like envy. My family thought I was exaggerating Blackwood's attention. They told me I should be flattered that I was being too particular in rejecting such a wealthy suitor. Then your family failed you, Nathaniel said bluntly, just as the legal system failed both of you when it refused to take Blackwood's harassment seriously. But that's changing. Because of Eve's testimony, because of the attention her case brought, there are new laws being proposed to protect women from stalking and harassment. Your courage in coming forward now and agreeing to testify that will help ensure Blackwood stays in prison and that other women have legal recourse we didn't have 5 years ago. Rebecca's testimony at Blackwood's appeal hearing was devastating in its simplicity and power. She described years of harassment eerily similar to what Eve had experienced, culminating in threats that drove her from her home and family. The appeals court denied Blackwood's request for a reduced sentence, and Rebecca found closure she had never thought possible. As the years passed, the Remington partnership became legendary. Their Alliance Institute graduated thousands of women who went on to transform American society. Their collaborative writings on labor and women's rights became foundational texts. Their children grew into adults who carried forward their parents' commitment to justice and equality. Beatrice becoming a prominent suffrage leader, Augustus, a labor lawyer who represented workers' unions, and Margaret, a physician who opened a clinic for working-class women. And Nathaniel and Eve continued to love each other with the fierce, joyful intensity of two people who had chosen each other freely and continued choosing each other every day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they returned to the Newport Chapel where they had married amid chaos and violence. They stood together at the altar, just the two of them, and renewed their vows privately. I, Nathaniel, still take thee, Genevieve, to be my wedded wife. Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. To have and to hold as my partner, my ally, my equal in all things for the rest of my days. I, Genevieve, still take thee, Nathaniel, to be my wedded husband, Eve replied, her own voice thick with emotion. To have and to hold as my partner, my ally, my equal in all things for the rest of my days. They kissed then in the empty chapel with the memory of gunfire and chaos somehow transformed into a reminder of their strength rather than their vulnerability. And when they walked out into the October sunlight hand in hand, they carried with them the certainty that what they had built together through deception and danger, through courage and love, would outlast them both. Their legacy was not just in the institutions they founded or the laws they helped pass. It was in the model they provided of what marriage could be when two people met as equals. It was in the children they raised to question authority and demand justice. It was in the thousands of women who found their voices through the Institute. It was in the workers whose rights were protected by Nathaniel's reforms. It was in every couple who looked at the Remingtons and thought perhaps that's possible for us too. Nathaniel lived to the age of 79, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1934, with Eve's hand in his and their grandchildren playing in the next room. Eve lived another 13 years, becoming a revered figure in the suffrage movement, living to see women gain the vote, writing her memoirs in her 80s and finally passing away at the age of 93 in 1947, surrounded by 3 generations of descendants who carried forward her commitment to equality and justice. Her memoir, published posthumously, was titled The Deception's Reward: How Lies Brought Truth and Fear Brought Love. It became an instant bestseller, and the final passage was quoted in countless wedding ceremonies for generations to come. We came together through deception, my husband and I. Our parents lied about who we were, what we wanted, what we expected from marriage. They manipulated us into an arrangement we might never have chosen had we known the truth. And yet from those lies came the most profound truth I have ever known, That partnership between equals is not just possible, but transformative. That love built on mutual respect and genuine choice is stronger than any obsession or possession. That two people meeting as allies rather than owner and property can build a legacy that ripples forward through generations. We were brought together by deception. We stayed together by choice. And that choice, renewed every day for 47 years, was the greatest gift of my life. In the end, the Remingtons proved what their partnership had always promised, that the most revolutionary act is not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but the daily choice to see each other as fully human, fully equal, fully worthy of respect and love. They proved it on an October day in 1887 when a bride shot her stalker and then finished getting married. They proved it every morning for 5 decades when they sat down to breakfast as partners rather than as master and subordinate. They proved it in every child they raised, every institution they founded, every law they helped pass, every couple they inspired to demand better from their own marriages. And they proved it in the simple, profound act of loving each other, not despite their equality, but because of it, not in spite of their partnership, but through it, not as owner and property, but as allies who chose each other over and over again until the very end. Their love story began with deception, it continued with danger, it was cemented with courage, and it ended with a legacy that transformed a generation and planted seeds for a revolution in human partnership that continues to bloom even today. This is the story of Nathaniel and Genevieve Remington. This is the story of a deception that rewarded truth. This is the story of two allies who became lovers, two partners who became legends, two equals who proved that the most enduring romance is built not on passion alone, but on respect, choice, and the daily renewal of commitment to each other's full humanity. And it all began on an autumn afternoon when a woman stepped from a railway carriage and a man whispered in wonder, "She cannot possibly be my bride." She was, and she was everything.